This is a very nice chapter which talks about self-governance in the laboratory. So far we set up action arenas. Sometimes I'm creating some hissing sound in these recordings, which I apologize for. I tinker with these things and they end up creating noise, but nonetheless. We looked at action arenas, agents, action situations, and then we did some social dilemma experiments in the lab and in the field. We found some good news that human beings are not really rational egoists or selfish egoists. They don't always maximize their self-interest, and that works even when you don't know who you are dealing with and you will never meet that person again, such as the ultimatum game and the dictator game, where in the dictator game you are given some money or something and you can share as much as you want with the other person. The other person has no option of rejecting the offer, and you don't know the person, and yet the amount people share is surprisingly high. It's not zero, and it's not even very low, right? It can be as close to 50% as possible. And the idea there also was that people who are exposed to markets also behave the same way. Why does it matter? Because in the market you are buying and selling things from people you don't know. You don't know who's making it. The person who's selling it is not making it, and you are ordering online and so on. So a lot of these blind transactions happen, and there is a lot of trust built in. And what are the reasons why such trust builds up and how it works? We already know from the examples in the social dilemmas that when we give information about credit card or other things to people like an online vendor, we are trusting the vendor to protect our credit card information and just do the service at complete safety provided as a guarantee. So we'll look here at self-governance in the laboratory. Again, it's important to remember that what we did in terms of social dilemmas was to do things in the lab, learn something, but do them in the field still as experiments. There are people involved who know that they are in an experiment. They know the rules sometimes, they know the regulations that they are dealing with, the norms, the punishments, and it is a limited number of people in the so far we only dealt with 2 players at a time and so on. Here it'll get more complicated, but still the main idea is that it's not a free world where people are doing what they do anyways, going about their business, and you are observing them without perturbing the situation. The Heisenberg principle, if if you observe something, you're likely to perturb it. But in this case, again, we will do experiments in the lab, then take it to the field, and what we learn is still very important and applicable to the real world, as Eleanor Ostrom's work showed. So let's go ahead and see what we are going to learn then in terms of self-governance in the lab. Key concept in this chapter: we will be introduced to public good and common pool resource experiments. So we'll learn what they are. We think you already know what common pool resources are. It could be a lake, a forest, air, and so on, where your use of the resource affects the other person's ability to use the resource. You are harvesting something which is another person's, it's taken out of another person's share of the resource. Public goods, Wikipedia is a good example, or here I'm creating this YouTube channel, giving it to you for free. I may be making money from YouTube, which I'm not making yet, and yet it is still free for you. So YouTube can host my podcasts, make money from it, and share the profits with me, which they don't share unless you meet their guidelines of how many hours people watch, how often you post new material, and so on and so forth, right? So they're playing ads on my channel already. When you click on it, they play commercials, but I'm not getting paid for it, right? Only when I meet their standards I get paid. So this is kind of a complicated real-time situation, but you know that my YouTube channel for you is free, so you could be Of course, you're paying a price in terms of having to watch the commercial for a few seconds before it gives you the option of skipping. Okay. We will learn about the important roles of costly sanctioning and communication. Costly sanctioning, we'll learn quickly that it's where you want to punish somebody in the system that's not following the rules or trying to free ride, and that punishment is going to cost you something, so it's not free. So you punish somebody even if it means reducing your benefit in that sense. And communication, it turns out, is very important because it creates more trust and more cooperation, as we'll see. We'll observe that the findings in the lab are confirmed in the field, but again, remember that these are experiments in the field. Become aware of more dynamic and interactive experiments as at the frontier of experimental methods. It's written here as the frontier of experimental methods, but maybe they meant at the frontier of experimental methods. So this is self-governance in the lab. Learning from peasants, starting with an example. During field work in Nepal in the 1980s, Eleanor Ostrom learned from interviews that farmers monitored each other's water withdrawals and contributions to maintenance. So they were harvesting a resource, common pool resource, and they knew there were other users. So they were watching how much each one is withdrawing and how much they are contributing to the upkeep of the common pool resource. She also observed a dramatic event in which a group of farmers dropped their work to repair a mud-based canal from which a farmer was withdrawing water illegally. So obviously somebody had made a provision to extract water illegally. Farmers found out and they contributed free labor to fix the problem. Okay, so this is important. So the putting time into repairing the canal costs them something, money they could be earning, but they do it. So this is a punishment in some sense. Back in the US, Ostrom discussed these events with colleagues in economics. The initial response from the economists was that it was illogical to invest so much time in monitoring and enforcement. We already learned that assuming selfish, egoist, rationalist human being is wrong, but the economists want to do supply, demand, cost benefit analysis, and for them, in an evolutionary sense also this is important. Do we really do anything unless there is some direct or indirect benefit? We found out that it's not so simple, that rational choice is not a theory that really works, but we don't have a good alternative so far. Maybe peasants would do this, economists argued, but people with higher levels of formal education would never do this self-policing. Okay, so they thought this was related to the education level. As a result, new experiments were designed where participants could give up earnings to reduce the earnings of others, which is why we call it costly sanctioning. Although it is irrational for rational egoists to do so, actual participants did use this costly sanctioning. The important role of costly sanctioning is now well established. We talked in adaptation about doing cost-benefit analysis on adaptation projects and having difficulty putting numbers on non-market goods like well-being. Nature-based solutions, greenness, let's say in cities, is good for well-being. Well-being allows you to deal with stresses and crises better. How do you put a value on that? So these are always tricky things. Introduction to the chapter. In the last chapter we explored social dilemmas involving only two players playing one time only and making very simple decisions. So you played once, you knew the rules, you knew the costs and benefits, and you were making essentially very simple decisions. In this chapter we will look at more complex experiments involving public goods and common pool resources. These dilemmas are the main focus of this course. In chapter 4 we saw that these types of goods are difficult to exclude others from using. Public goods like Wikipedia, national defense, public radio and clean air can be used by everybody, yet there are costs to individuals to invest in the provision of public goods. So you may not be contributing to Wikipedia, but you may be using it regularly. Now Wikipedia does send you a request for contributions every year, but those are voluntary contributions. They cannot really force you to contribute. So if I contribute to Wikipedia and you use it, I'm doing it. Why? It costs me time, which means I'm losing money I could be making by doing something else. By doing this podcast and putting it on YouTube channel, I could be making money from YouTube, but so far I haven't done it. I already put up 20 courses, which means I'm doing this for my own satisfaction, and I don't track who's using it and whether they are giving me credit. I do get some messages from students and others saying that teachers are using my podcasts to teach, but they don't point the students to the YouTube channel because they probably don't want me to. They don't want the students to find out they are taking lessons from the YouTube. But I don't care. You learn. Teacher does his or her job of learning from somewhere and teaching you. And there are people who give talks to media and public about, climate change solutions, adaptations, this, that, which are also apparently taking material from my channels, not attributing their knowledge to me, but I'm not requiring them to do that. It's up to them. If they want to, cite my source, then it says something about them, not me, right? So with experiments, we can test the assumption that public goods cannot be provided voluntarily. The same is true for common pool resources, which are vulnerable to over-harvesting. So creating common pool goods and harvesting common pool resources are, still involving human behaviors. We'll see what they are and how they are related to what it is all about. How they are related to sustaining the commons. Okay, common pool resource action situations. In chapter 4, we introduced the idea that with common pool resources, it is difficult to exclude or limit other users' consumption of the resource, and each person's consumption of the resource reduces the availability for others. We will now discuss how the basic dilemma in a common pool resource setting can be translated into an action situation that we will subsequently use in a laboratory experiment. So we'll come back and set those up, and we'll start with a static baseline situation. So all those experiments we talked about social dilemmas in the lab, in the field, they are lab experiments or field experiments. They are experiments, as we said, and they can be used as baselines. And the lessons we get, the quantitative measures we get about humans' cooperation, self-governance, rationalist choice, egoist choices, they are all real. Then the tricky part is to use them in actually managing the resources in the real world, and we'll do that at the end, of course. The entire life's work of Elinor Ostrom was basically that, right? So we'll come back and look at further details in the next podcast.